I always start out, although we got one former PHMC employee here, but I always start out by talking a little bit about who we are, where we come from. Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission is the state's official history agency. We have a number of different hats we wear. We do manage the State Museum here in Harrisburg. We also manage the State Archives, the big tall tower there with all the records. And we have a number of historic sites and museums around the state that interpret different aspects of Pennsylvania history. The office that I work in is called the State Historic Preservation Office. And each state was directed to establish one of these as part of the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966. We run a number of federal preservation programs, among them including the National Register of Historic Places. We review federal and state projects to determine their effects on historic and cultural resources. And we work with the National Park Service on the Certified Local Government Program. And under the Pennsylvania History Code, the state law, we have a number of responsibilities assigned to our office, among them the Historical and Museum Commission's grant programs, the Historical Marker Program, the program that puts up the blue and gold markers that you see around the state. And we provide technical assistance for communities, including helping to manage local historic district ordinances according to the Historic District Act, which I'll talk more about in a minute here. So that's kind of my role in that last part. That's basically all I do is I answer people's questions, provide technical assistance to local governments, local organizations, regional groups about planning for historic resources and how to preserve them, to give them ideas about how to preserve them. So one thing I always like to start with is a definition about what is historic and what does that mean. The National Register of Historic Places is kind of the benchmark that's long been used for designating a historic resource. It's the nation's official list of historic resources that are worthy of preservation. These can be individual buildings, they can be historic districts, sites, structures, or objects. The criteria basically boils down to three quick questions. Is it more than 50 years old? Is it historically or architecturally significant? And does it retain integrity? Meaning, does it have the physical characteristics that it needs to reflect that history and significance? National Register does not restrict private property owners' ability to alter property, to manage it, or they can even demolish it if they want. Doesn't require that it be restored, doesn't mean that owners have to open it to the public. It's primarily, for private property owners' purposes, it's primarily an honorary thing. You know, you can brag to your neighbors that your property is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register was really kind of invented and established primarily as a federal planning tool. So whenever PennDOT's putting in a new lane in a highway, whenever you see a pipeline coming through, it's been coming up a lot lately, all those kinds of issues where there's a federal activity involved, then our office has to review that federal activity to determine what effect that activity will have on historic resources. And this is how we define a historic resource. If it's eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, then it's a historic resource, and the agency needs to consult with us on what the best way is to ideally avoid it, but otherwise minimize the effects on that historic resource. So that's kind of where we often show up in the news, is those kinds of projects, but that's the primary purpose of the National Register of Historic Places. Now, State Historic Preservation Offices, one of the requirements that we have in our office is that every 5 years we're supposed to establish a statewide historic preservation plan. And we just recently unveiled our newest one. We got all social media crazy about it. We put a hashtag in front of it. Hashtag preservation happens here. And it's basically, it lays out kind of what we feel is important about preserving historic resources in Pennsylvania and how we think both our agency and our partners and our local governments can help preserve those historic places. So we have a goal, like goal number 2 there is use the power of planning to transform Pennsylvania's historic places into vibrant and diverse communities. And it has a whole list of what can we do, things that each community can consider and think, okay, now this would be one way that we could take a role and help to implement this statewide preservation plan. On a smaller scale, our office established, we call it our Guidance for Historic Preservation Planning. That basically lays out some steps that we recommend to local communities for planning for historic preservation. And already you're taking a lot of those kinds of steps. You're kind of trying to think through what's your history, what are the places that are important to that history, and trying to figure out what it is that you really want to do to protect and preserve those historic places. But that's something that we can work with you on if you want to kind of flesh out and make it a little bit more, kind of come up with a more detail about kind of not only how to prevent demolition, but maybe how to actively help your community preserve those historic places. Local designation is what you've already been talking about, and there's two ways that's done here in Pennsylvania. One is under the Historic District Act. This is a state law that enables local municipalities to establish local historic districts that are regulated by a Board of Historic Architectural Review, which is often referred to as a HARP. And there are plenty of examples around here. Carlisle has one, Harrisburg has one, Lincolnstown formerly had one. So that's one way to do it, and it does only apply to historic districts. It's largely concentrations of historic buildings. The other way that you can regulate historic properties in Pennsylvania is under the municipality's planning code, and that's basically through zoning that you can establish zoning rules, which is essentially what you're doing with your historic properties section in your zoning ordinance. The overlay zoning, which is essentially what you're doing, is an overlay. In other words, you're not saying that every one of these is a zoning district in all and of itself. It's part of another zoning district, but then you're overlaying another layer of regulation on top of that based on, in this case, age at this point. So you can regulate. The advantage of using zoning is that you can regulate both historic districts and individual properties. So that's what allows you to create a list or a map or whichever you end up with to kind of do a bunch of scattered sites all over the community. You can regulate, obviously, demolition, new and infill construction, which as often happens, especially in historic districts, where you want to, not only do you want to make sure that the building that's torn down wasn't critical to your community's historic character, but what's the new building going to look like and how is that going to affect its historic appearance? You can also, through zoning, you can review building rehabilitation and alteration, just like they do in HARBs. And while it hasn't actually been tested in courts, it is something that is done in some communities. And landscape features and site improvements. So things like, theoretically, you could create some sort of a zoning overlay over some of those historic places, maybe cemeteries or rail corridors or places that have historic significance because it's a place, not because there's a building there. So you could also regulate that. There's different ways that communities use. There's no real specific guidelines about how this happens, what these ordinances look like. And that's always a challenge for local communities because they always feel kind of at sea when they start out with these things. And so a lot of them use different types of zoning tools to regulate. It might be a traditional neighborhood development so that you kind of maintain character of a neighborhood. Sometimes they use form-based zoning, which puts less reliance on the use of the building and more reliance on what the building shape and form looks like and how it fits into the community. Then there's also the subdivision and land development ordinance. There are some townships which review essentially any time that if there's like a historic farm and someone wants to subdivide that into either commercial development or residential development. Some communities have ordinances under the subdivision and land development ordinance that kind of give an outline about how that review process should be so that you maintain that historic character as much as you can. And that can include both regulations, kind of prohibitions against doing certain things, but can also provide incentives. For instance, one common incentive is density bonuses. So in other words, say you got 5 acres of land and that would allow you to build 10 houses Well, you know, if you've got an overlay here and there's a historic house on the property, you could allow that developer to build 10 houses and keep the old house, so that so you're not providing a disincentive to keep that house, keep that historic house. So those are the kinds of things you can do under subdivision and land development. There's a number of townships that have used, and this is just a kind of a partial list of things that we're not involved in this process, so it's often by word of mouth that we hear about these township ordinances. But here's a few of the ones that we know of, and a lot of them, as you see, are in southeastern Pennsylvania, where they do have some sort of zoning overlays or something like that to regulate historic properties. One thing I just want to mention, and this is kind of advanced, but sometimes people want to know about this stuff right up front. The Certified Local Government Program is a program that's run in cooperation between our agency and the National Park Service, and that provides specialized technical assistance and potentially funding assistance for local governments that are certified. And to be certified, a local municipality has to have some sort of an ordinance in place, somewhat like the ordinance you already have in place. So that's something that some communities want to step up and take this step up and be designated as certified local governments. There's 45 of them in Pennsylvania right now. Some of them are townships. So that's always an avenue if you want to kind of really kind of challenge yourself to play a leadership role in preservation. A couple of things that I wanted to mention that are tools that communities can use are the Keystone Historic Preservation Project grants. These are state-funded grants. They're funded by the Keystone Recreation Park and Conservation Fund. And you can, a township or a local nonprofit organization can apply for funding, 50-50 matching grants, to prepare like a nomination form for a National Register property. You can do surveys. In other words, you could do a more defined analysis of the historic resources, the buildings that were built before 1930 in the community, to kind of have good information about all those, so that you're not kind of flying in the dark on that. You can develop historic district design guidelines. You could look at specific historic properties that are threatened in some way and develop a feasibility study for preserving that building. All those kinds of things are eligible in these project grants, which are kind of the planning side of things. The other grants that are available are the Keystone Historic Preservation Construction Grants, and this is for actual restoration and rehabilitation of historic buildings that are open to the public. And again, this is available to nonprofit organizations and local governments, and they can rehabilitate a wide variety of properties. Courthouses and municipal buildings, historic sites, churches are eligible, theaters, schools, community facilities are also eligible under the Keystone Grant Program. Now, both these programs are fairly competitive. We don't have a whole lot of money each year, so you have to really, ideally, contact our staff and get some assistance with those if you're interested in applying, so that you get a good sense of how to write a really strong application. Because again, we can only fund about 25 or 30% of the applications that we get in each year. So again, my name is Brian. Karen Arnold is the Historic Preservation Grant Manager. So those are some of the programs we have. The one thing I wanted to get into a little bit, just hearing your conversation earlier, I have looked at your ordinance, and one of the things that kind of is consistently mentioned in conversations that I've heard and seen in email and that sort of thing is kind of a reluctance to deny a demolition permit application. But the ordinance implies that the township supervisors could, technically, if they felt that a property was really key and important and significant, and that the owner did not prove that there weren't any other alternatives, supervisors could potentially say, no, sorry, you can't get a demolition permit. You're going to have to come up with another alternative. It's a little bit of a challenge, but they're perfectly within their rights under the ordinance to deny it. One thing that might be useful, if you were interested in kind of strengthening that, would be to actually put in a provision about what happens if the township supervisors choose to deny a demolition permit, and that is kind of what's the notification process, what are the owner's alternatives at that point, all those kinds of things, just to make sure that you got yourself covered. Another thing that a lot of communities have in their zoning ordinances is that they establish some group of people who will review this. Your ordinance pretty much says, it's a supervisor's decision. A lot of communities, like a lot of the townships that I showed you in southeastern Pennsylvania, they actually assign their historical commission with the responsibility of reviewing these applications and making a recommendation to the supervisors as to what they feel, the supervisors should do about that. And that helps to, number one, it gives the supervisors a little bit of a political breathing room, because they're not seen as being acting in an arbitrary manner, and it also provides the historical commission, the people who have the interest and the knowledge, the ability to kind of really be very clear in explaining why this property is of that significance, or why they feel that there is a real good opportunity or option here of preserving the building rather than demolishing it. So that's something that again, that you could appoint the ordinance could define the historical commission as the reviewing body, or it could say that the supervisors may appoint some either other group or an ad hoc group or something like that to review these applications. And just again, it's a nice way to kind of ensure that you've got the right people looking at these applications. So that's another thought that I had in looking at your ordinance. As you pointed out, the ordinance right now does allow you to protect properties throughout the township. I fully support your idea that you really should develop criteria that you will eventually use to kind of define which of those properties is really going to be very protected, as opposed to which of those ones that you say, well, yeah, it was built before 1930, but it's really not that critical anymore. It doesn't look like the building was built before 1930, already in such sorry shape that it really, to expect anybody to preserve it is not really realistic. So that's something that you can do, and that defining that criteria, and that's something that we can help you come up with, will kind of help protect you and protect the township in the long run, because then someone can't say, well, why is my building historic and my neighbor's isn't, and that sort of thing. So I think that's important. The other thing too is, another good point that came out of that discussion earlier, is that ideally, this should be a very public process. This list, and especially once you've come up with some criteria, you need to really make sure that the residents and the property owners all know about that, even to the point of perhaps notifying all the owners of those properties that are on that list, to make sure that they understand that this is a new thing that they're going to be asked to do. And if they want to complain, they're welcome to. That's their right to complain about that. It may not make a difference. You may still pass that ordinance and still designate their property, but it's something that you need to make sure that everybody is very clear on what the rules are and how you came about those new rules. So that's in a nutshell of what I heard and what we've got to offer from the State Historic Preservation Office. But I'm really happy to take any questions you have. Oh, got a couple of them.
Quick question, and this might be more of the umbrella here from what we're working on. But can you tell us what historical significance, what the definition of that would be?
In the National Register of Historic Places, they have like areas of significance. So they kind of define different aspects of history that are important, and then you say whether or not this property is really important in reflecting that history. So, you know, if you're very concerned about kind of the early settlement of the township, you can say, well, this is an important story here, and you know, these properties are properties that were among the first to be settled here, and this person was one of the, you know, this is where the guy lived, but he laid out all this land around here and set up the town and all that sort of thing. That all has to do with settlement. We've got at the statewide level, we've developed an agricultural context. And so you could potentially, if you've got some farms left in the township that you feel are very important to be recognized for their significance as a farm, a long-standing farm, you may want to use that context to kind of say, yeah, this was important. You know, there are statistics that show that this was a high-producing farm back in the late 1800s, early 20th century. So that you can kind of, again, you can define that and say specifically, yes, this is historically significant as a farm. So that's a lot of times, it's usually associated with those themes. And it's always a good idea to kind of have that kind of context in the back of your head. So it's not just like any kind of random fact that you know, well, this was the first house built by a left-handed builder or something like that. You know,
because one of the things that this township has that's an honor to have are small items that some people don't even realize that's in their backyard, like cuts for a railroad that went bankrupt back in the 1800s, and it's what might seem insignificant and people pass it every day. To me, that would be extremely historically significant.
Yeah, I agree. I think transportation is often a really important theme, and we've gone through and identified kind of all the railroads of statewide significance all around the state to kind of say, okay, well, this was an important railroad. You know, some of the short lines we say, well, you know, it didn't last that long. It didn't play that big a role in the greater scheme of things. But certainly at the local level, pretty much, you know, I would say that you would be within your rights to say this is important because it was the only railroad, or it was, you know, one of the primary railroads, or that served served both passengers or freight or whatever it is that you want to show up. I think you were next.
When you and I first spoke a couple of months ago, I mentioned to you our background and what we were trying to create. And one of our big items is to find a place in the township where we can put on display, preserve the massive amount of material which we have from our history. When we find that building, because we will eventually, would that qualify for this project?
Yeah, we fund a lot of local historical organizations in terms of whether they set up a house museum or like county historical societies, township, and local historical societies often will move into a historic building and rehabilitate that and adapt it for use as a museum or exhibit space, which or a lot of times it's multi-use, meeting space and all sorts of different things. So definitely, yeah. Again, the main point will be you need to think it all through. And we always caution groups that kind of bite off more than they can chew in taking down a historic property, especially nonprofit organizations have to raise funds for them and that sort of thing. Sometimes we're very cautious about them and want to make sure that they think through how they're going to keep that up and running in the long run. Sure.
Okay, I don't know if you were here earlier. Denise Steiner headed up a group of 3 of us. We went through and finished locating properties up to and including the year 1930 in order to update our GIS map.
Right.
They plan on adding those properties into the map, and of course that will be available on the township website, along with a list of those properties, correct, Amanda? What will be included in the list? Is that going to have addresses and so on?
That's up for the historical commission to decide what gets posted.
Okay, then my question would be, because of what you said about notifying owners and so on, should that be done before a list of addresses and so on is put out for the public in general?
I would kind of think so. Now, I mean, the other option is you could post it and say, these are the properties that we are considering, you know, and then maybe dedicate, you know, a historical commission meeting to having people come in and give you their feedback on that. You know, that might be one way to do it before it, you know, in effect, you kind of do a soft launch, if you will, you know, and before it kind of is official.
Okay, then,
Either way, the township supervisors will have to adopt this in order for it to be regulated under the ordinance.
okay, so then the only site that should probably be posted on is the township site. It shouldn't be on any of the other websites for the time being.
I think, I mean,
I think, if somebody gets involved.
yeah, well, I mean, I think what you need to do is you either need to make sure there's a caveat, you know, kind of explain the process wherever you post it, you know, have that kind of all spelled out, or, you know, refer people, you know, just have a link and say, okay, here's the link is available on the township website or something like that. That way, if you want to kind of make sure that there's not like multiple versions floating around or something like that. Yes?
In regard to cemeteries, we do have a cemetery, Newside Cemetery, where all the stones around in the 1880s or so, Dave, you can correct me on this, were consolidated into a small plot. But actually, the cemetery itself, which dates back to the 1750s, may expand into some property owned by a homeowners association. Is there possibly funds to be able to explore what the actual size of that cemetery is? You know what the size of the lot was when it was first made a cemetery, but exactly where everybody is buried is unclear, but all the stones were consolidated around 100 years ago. Is that something that might be feasible?
The one aspect of the grant program is that in order to qualify for a grant, the property that's receiving the grant has to be eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. Cemeteries are a little tricky when it comes to the National Register, just because, well, there's just so many of them. Defining what is a significant cemetery is a little bit harder.
There are veterans of the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 and the French and Indian War buried there. In fact, there's a large a monument from the dawn of the American Revolution that they put there in 1927. So it's something that's recognized. That's the only piece of rock that has stayed in the place it was originally put.
I guess not to sound too Debbie Downer, but I think I would discourage you from kind of putting your eggs in the basket of a state grant. Now, that being said, there's been several examples lately of there are universities that have the capacity to kind of study that using what they call ground penetrating radar to find out and that might be something that you might want to pursue because they may be willing to do that just as kind of well, number one, to play with their toys, but also, you know, as a public service. So that might be a good approach. I think it's really important that somebody really have a better sense of where that cemetery is before, especially if it's in the middle of a development. You had a question back there.
Yeah, I was wondering because you have a grant for the rehabilitation and restoring, and it's open to the public. Do you educate people or remind people their responsibilities towards the Americans with Disabilities Act, that it needs to be open to the public, so it needs to be accessible in the early design? We certainly,
we don't, while we don't police that in an official way. We certainly expect it. You know, any well-designed project should address that because
You
it's,
look quite the grant writing then.
yeah. I mean, it really needs to be addressed. I mean, if our review panels are you know, include architects and they're pretty savvy about these things, so if they see stuff that's missing that isn't addressed, then they will point that out very often. So I mean, it's a real concern, and it's something that can be a challenge with historic properties, but in pretty much every case, we feel there's usually some way to incorporate accessibility features. It may not get you up to the second floor of a small house museum, but it will at least you'll be able to participate in programs there.
The main function areas.
Yeah.
And the other question is, with the planning that they're doing and the ordinance, does that, like, take into consideration any aspects of the ADA, if any of the houses are historic or any of the facilities that they're including, wind up being open to the public? Is there a reminder that it needs to be ADA, preserving the historic content or the functional, I forget the term you used, but is there something in there that would protect people with disabilities in their own township from not being able to participate in public opportunities?
Well, I think, again, it's something that we're very familiar with. We're not the ones who police it. There are requirements under building codes that require, especially properties that are open to the public. So hopefully the township would be on top of that. If there was a substantial amount of work being done to rehabilitate a property, they're going to need to meet some of those code requirements, which will include accessibility.
It'd be great if the township considers that too, in making it more public, ensuring that people who are opening businesses or opening establishments to the public are accessible up front.
Yes?
Yeah. So,
Did you
have
a question? You had a question? No?
No, I was just actually going to respond to your ground penetrating layer thing, and I can talk to you after about that. I know how you can get that done, so I can talk to you about that.
On that new side, in years gone by, when it wasn't mowed, I would go there and trim and mow it. And when I looked at it lately, the last couple times, that thing's looking a lot smaller than it used to be. I mean, I mowed more than what was there. And if they were consolidated 100 years ago, someone has reconsolidated, because that's an awful small footprint. And those people that drive by it here and acknowledge that, they probably notice what I've noticed. And if it was existing land as a cemetery, there must be an original map giving the footprint of that. And at least those boundaries could be reestablished. I mean, somebody has to have that information.
Yeah, you would hope that there would be something in record somewhere. Was it a family cemetery or a church cemetery, or what was it?
New side church. There was a church there. I don't know where the church was that these guys do. Joe knows everything. Where was the church?
The church was right, well, the road, I think, cut into the church.
Okay.
But it was right there by the cemetery.
It just seems so weedy now.
Yeah, well, the development goes around it too. Brian, I want to thank you very much. I don't want to cut you short, but at the same time, I want you to come back.